And our next speaker is Judith Thompson, who is Emerita Professor of Romantic Literature at Dalhousie University and the University of King's College in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and General Secretary and Archivist of the John Thelwall Society. She's a leader in the field of Thelwall studies and the author of 4 books and editions by and about this romantic, radical, and polymath, as well as numerous articles and chapters. She's currently completing Citizen John, A Voice for the Voiceless, the first full biography of Thelwall that I'm really looking forward to. So, and indeed to your talk. Thank you.
So welcome, everybody. I'm changing gears a little bit from the papers that so far have revolved around the donation, that the materials that were donated, having to do with radicalism in Yarmouth and Norfolk. I'm focusing on another much smaller manuscript. I also wanted to say my title has changed slightly, although it didn't come out on the PowerPoint. So the third part is Radical Regeneration, but it doesn't really matter. So I'm looking at a much smaller manuscript, not part of the donation, but is equally significant, offering a broader perspective on connections, cultural and political, between Thelwall and radical Norfolk. It is drawn from my Citizen John Thelwall, A Voice for the Voiceless, which, as you've heard, is the first ever complete biography of this groundbreaking popular orator, poet, and polymath. It's now almost finished, and it fills in the blanks, the many blanks of his dramatic life, fitting him back into the history from which he was undeservedly omitted, thanks in part to the persecution that Steve was just telling us so much about, in part from the failure of his wife to complete her 1838 biography, as well as the mysterious disappearance of his archive. From the perspective of Thelwall's entire life, Norfolk is not an end or turning point, far less a defeat, but the starting point of Thelwall's brilliantly successful, though now largely forgotten, 30-year career as a lecturer on the art, act, and science of elocution. 2 subjects, lectures and elocution, largely overlooked by historians. Elocution may not seem very radical, but it was as much so as classical history, which is on which he lectured here, and which his elocution lectures also incorporated. In the hands, or more accurately, on the tongue of Thelwall, both were forms of what he called seditious allegory, strategically disguising and redirecting his dangerously democratic principles to allow him to preserve and promote them in an age of repression by traveling through the nation, teaching practical fluency to laboring manufacturers, as he put it in his chief work of political theory, The Rights of Nature, written in between his 2 visits to Norfolk in 1796 and 97. Now, this is my very homemade map, 2 maps, in fact, of just some of the densely interwoven intellectual networks of reform he linked in the decade that followed. So those radical circles and the links between them, Thelwall served as the thread joining them together. Lecturing on elocution. Thelwall inherited a tradition of elocution much more sophisticated aesthetically and politically than we have ever realized. It was not, or at least not just, about speaking properly or politely, rather about speaking with power and agency to claim freedom from below. This movement of dissent, diversity, and self-determination began in 1726, 40 years before Thelwall was born, when a very eccentric religious and political dissenter named Orator Henley established his Universal Academy above a meat market in Soho, where for 30 years he taught mutual free communication for the equal benefit of persons of all ranks, from butchers downstairs to a visiting Voltaire. And it continued, this elocution movement, into the 20th century, at late as least as George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, better known as My Fair Lady, whose elocutionist hero, Henry Higgins, was based at least in part on Thelwall, whom anti-Jacobins had satirized as Orator Higgins, you can see on the left there, a stereotype 18th century Irish bull figure who gained audiences and wisdom from the streets. So I begin with this handwritten fragment of one of Thelwall's poems, and I have the manuscript here. It's been flattened. This is what the picture was. I could lay it out on the table, maybe I could possibly pass it around. I'm not sure. I think maybe, I'm not sure. I think I'll leave it, but you can see it. Rolled up and fastened by a ribbon with a decorative clasp, you can see down there on the lower right-hand side, into which a white feather had been inserted, and you can see the white feather there in the center. It was found beneath the floorboards of a 17th century manor house on the high street of Cly next the sea, about 25 miles north of here, about 2 years ago by Mr. Gavin Nixon, a builder who specializes in heritage renovation. And I want to take this opportunity to thank Mr. Nixon, who is unable to be here, but for approaching the Thelwall Society when he found it, and for so generously sharing his find with us today. It was this that brought me here from Canada, for it fits my career-long approach to, indeed, obsession with Thelwall. A, because it's a fragment, like so much of Thelwall's archive that is slowly being rediscovered. And B, because like Thelwall, it is tantalizingly romantic in two senses of that word. First, it is a sentimental poem, a concept and a genre always intertwined with Thelwall's political thought, as per the defining compound adjective of his peripatetic, politico-sentimental, though scholars have tended to separate and devalue the sentimental. Second, the manuscript, like Thelwall, is part of the transnational movement we now know as Romanticism, in which Thelwall was not just the silenced partner of the well-known poets Coleridge and Wordsworth, as I argued in this book published in 2012, but a romantic genius in his own right, who quite simply but profoundly did for voice what Will Blake did for vision. This manuscript fragment is the fifth of 10 stanzas of The Orphan Boy, a ballad that dates from 1801 when it was published in Thelwall's Poems Chiefly Written in Retirement. It became one of his most widely known and longest-lived poems, having circulated not just in that volume, which went through at least 2 editions, but in a halfpenny broadsheet as a popular song, then republished in 1830 in both a fashionable anthology of fugitive poetry and a chapbook of children's nursery rhymes, both of which were also reprinted as late as 1879. A simple, elegiac anti-war ballad in the voice of the orphan child, it is not as overtly political as the now better known seditious allegories like the rollicking sheep shearing song by Thelwall, but it is equally full of ironies. It's more like Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience than Wordsworth's lyrical ballads in that regard. It poignantly contrasts the music and gaiety of the crowd sending off the boy's father, eager for glory and battle, with the tears and sighs of his mother, especially when news of the father's death arrives and she too dies, leaving the boy an orphan. The ballad's connection to Thelwall's Norwich circles is reinforced by its head note And I should add, unlike many of his more famous Romantic contemporaries, Thelwall always acknowledged his sources. In this case, another popular poem, The Orphan Boy's Tale by Amelia Opie, née Alderson, about whom more in a minute. As Thelwall notes, the plots of the two poems are indeed almost identical, but while Opie's has a philanthropic, happy ending in which the orphan is given food, clothing, and work by a gentle lady, Thelwall's ending is bluntly ironic, emphasizing the burthen of loss in a chorus that repeats with variation his key motif of a circle of affection where the child is first embraced by, then forever alienated from, the kiss of love that went round. Both that broken bond and the ironic wordplay on burthen, which means at once a physical weight and a musical chorus, are characteristically Thelwallian, the former manifesting his fundamental ethical principle of reciprocity, the latter demonstrating the philosophical materialism and multivalence that underlie his elocutionary poetics, ethical romance, and democratic politics alike. Aside from the poem's tale and history, the most romantic aspects of this Thelwall discovery are its hiding place and that mysterious white feather. What does it mean? Who might have put it there and when? Now, it was a common custom to tuck away valuable keepsakes in the recesses of walls and floors, a gesture as sentimental as the poem itself. But according to Mr. Nixon, the positioning of the rolled up paper suggests a structural rather than a sentimental function. As for the white feather, its meaning is even more mysterious. It symbolized peace, at least among American Quakers, as early as 1777, which would fit Thelwall's well-known pacifism and friendship with Quakers. But in Britain, according to Francis Gross's 1785 Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue, the white feather symbolized cowardice, with reference not to war as we think of it from World War I, but for cockfighting, where even a single white feather apparently signaled that your bird was not a true gamecock. Who knew? Thelwall's very public identification with gamecocks in his most notorious seditious allegory of the headless King Chanticleer might possibly account for the feather, but if they thought him a coward, why would they treat the poem rolled up the way it was as a valuable keepsake? It's just as likely that there's no personal connection to Thelwall at all. Maybe it was a gift to a young woman from her sweetheart going off to war, copied from a favorite poem, sealed with a romantic seabird's feather, if not a kiss. One clue to its provenance might be the handwriting, which does have some similarities with Thelwall's fine cursive script. And I've circled there the T's, the B's, and the word kiss in both poems. But I'm still not convinced, in particular the A's down the bottom of the left-hand side of the fragment and up at the top of the poem, The Theft. They're not at all the same. And the writing of the fragment is spikier than the rounded cursive on the poem there. Although I must say, when I just saw the letter from Thelwall in the room there, it's quite spiky. So, and sometimes his hand is more spiky. So it's close, but I'm not sure. The poem also obviously postdates Thelwall's visits to Norfolk in 96 and 97. There's no record of him ever returning, although he likely had friends here and kept them. And he lectured in Cambridge, at least, in the 1820s. And of course, the fragment might have been put under those floorboards anytime in the 19th century, given its printing history. Nor do we yet know who resided in the manor house. The only resident of Cley known to history at the time of Thelwall's Norfolk visits was Charlotte Jones, a painter of miniatures, just the kind of talented, independent woman to whom Thelwall was always attracted. But in 1800, she left Cley and joined fashionable artistic circles in London, where she became a friend and official portraitist of Princess Charlotte of Wales. Now, by 1806, Thelwall too was a fashionable celebrity in London. Their artistic circles may indeed have intersected, and he probably at least knew of Jones. But again, no evidence of any connection either between them or between either of them and the manor house in Cly. So, leaving aside the issue of identification, Jones and Alderson Opie draw attention to an important context for this manuscript and the second part of my title, the female citizens, who were a large part of the attraction of this radical city for Thelwall, as shown in this occasional address, composed roughly the same time as the orphan boy, for another talented female citizen of Norwich, Sophia Goddard, the daughter of Thelwall's London Corresponding Society friend Florimond Goddard, and a beloved actress at the Theatre Royal, Norwich, who died tragically young and is romantically memorialized here at the Church of St. Peter Mancroft. In Goddard's mouth, Thelwall delivered his own sentiments. Hail then the hour when first with doubtful mien I sought this kind, this hospitable scene, this circle sought to genius ever kind. Wherever fate shall guide my venturous bark or life's precarious tide, remembrance ne'er shall from this scene depart, but Norwich dwell forever in my heart. He notes that Goddard was a constant attendant on my political lectures and one of the beautiful young creatures by whom in my frequent social parties I was in the habit of being surrounded in London. And the same was true of Norfolk in 1796 and 7. Indeed, as we've heard, Thelwall was first invited to lecture here by a similarly talented and attractive young woman, the very Amelia Alderson, not yet married, who would write her Orphan Boy's Tale 4 years later. She and her friends, Anne and Belle Plumtree, were poets, novelists, playwrights, and translators. Anne and Belle published their first novels in 1796. Belle's Montgomery, set in Wales, was influenced by Thelwall's Peripatetic, and in turn probably influenced his choice of the Wye Valley as his place of poetical retirement the following year. Anne Plumtree's 1798 translation of a play on colonial Peru by the German playwright Kotzebue inspired Sheridan's hit 1799 play Pizarro, which in turn shared features of Thelwall's 1792 opera The Incas, though the latter was neither performed nor published. Did Anne know the Incas? Might she have been the conduit for that influence? Impossible to know. Either way, all three women were successful, ambitious, and reform-minded, members of that youthful circle who brought out the Norwich cabinet that we've heard about. Alderson was perhaps the most politically committed and impetuous, having attended the treason trials, allegedly climbing over the benches to kiss Pontic when he was acquitted, and having socialized with many London radicals, including Thelwall, at whose home she had dinner in that 1795 meeting we saw in the diary earlier. And she seems to have had a bit of a thing, as we've heard, for Godwin, and this would have been before he became intimate with Mary Wollstonecraft. Even before Thelwall met Mary Wollstonecraft, the influence of several strong female mentors and his youthful education in debating societies had turned him into a proto-feminist. As Nick Rowe has suggested, he was also a chivalric gallant, a long way from 21st century notions of consent. That poem, The Theft, if you saw any of it, is about a stolen kiss. But he was always respectful and encouraging of women's minds and voices, regularly lecturing on the superiority of female elocution and including women writers among his recitation selections. No wonder he admired Alderson, who in one of the election campaigns, it was either 94 or 96, made a long speech in the town hall to about 1,500 of the Jacobins assembled against Mr. Wyndham, with Anne and Belle standing one on either side of her to give her support. And that's from that Sarah Fielding letter. These female citizens added glamour and grace to the intellectual sociability that made Norwich the first of many other radical cities Thelwall visited, so mutually inspiring. They were numerous and welcoming enough to constitute what we would now call a Thelwall fan club. Now, that may seem anachronistic, but it isn't. For in fact, the language of fans, which all you ladies would have been carrying if this were 1796 or after, with which that language of fans with which women were, quote, armed as men with swords and sometimes did more execution with them, according to Joseph Addison in 1711. That was a common discourse of courtship. Thelwall composed an important series of poems written, or apparently written, on fans. Oh, there's my, language of the fan. And then poems, they were written on fans, they were addressed to his female fans, and they contained sophisticated reflections on the fan at the intersection of print and oral culture, a medium of enlightenment, instruction, conversation, and refreshment, and a metaphor for the unfolding of minds and bodies activated by his voice. You can see this clearly in the very first of these fan club poems, written to a Mrs. Baker in early 1797, exactly between his two visits to Norfolk, one of which offers a pocket history of print culture, making room for female genres, starting with barks of trees, then parchment skins, then books were formed, yet not in books alone. We find the means to paint the expanding mind. The letter in its secret fold can many a generous feeling hold, nor henceforth shall the playful fan be useless on instruction's plan. Now, we don't know anything else about Mrs. Baker, including whether or not she lived in Norfolk. But that she too was a female citizen is revealed by the name with which Thelwall honors her. I don't know if you can see this well there on the left-hand side, left-hand poem. Fulvia, the most powerful female politician in the Roman Republic, supporting popular plebeian causes with the assistance of her three husbands, one of whom was Mark Antony. Also note the image of the secret fold in both poems. Kind of gave me a little thrill to put that next to the conspicuous folds of our orphan boy fragment. Might it be considered one of the fan club poems? Might it even have been written on a fan? Probably not from the looks of it, but it sure adds to the mystery. Like Norwich and its welcoming female circles, the fan club poems were crucial to the survival of Thelwall's radicalism. They develop a strikingly original politico-erotic aesthetics that goes back to his prison poems at least, but was actively responsive at once to the sexual dynamics of his lectures and to the culture of controversy within which they were written, part of a deliberate strategy to sustain and promote his principles while compensating for and overcoming repression. For that reason, I call them seductive allegories, a type of seditious allegory that uses sentiment and eros as its kind of secret code to communicate that which was forbidden between the gagging acts of 1795 and the 6 acts of 1819. Over the years, they became increasingly explicit and experimental, one of them even creating a fascinating anatomical allegory between sex acts and speech acts. And I had a whole section on that I've taken out. You can ask me about it later. Oddly enough, and I'm adding something here that just kind of fits in a funny way, but it brings me back to Clay and that whole question of the manor house in Clay. Something I just discovered yesterday. That is a connection between the famous Gurney family of Norwich and the village of Clay. Not directly connected to Thelwall, much later, but still rather Thelwallian in its politico-erotic defiance of social norms and class hierarchies. Apparently what happened was around 1860, Mary Gurney, the 30-year-old wife of J.H. Gurney, distinguished banker, ornithologist, and soon-to-be MP, became pregnant by and ran off with the family groom, William Taylor, who was from Clay. It was considered a, quote, great outrage against the sensibilities and morals of the public and the numerous high families with which she is allied. But it's also a great example of the triumph of Eros over class and social distinctions. For Mary published Mrs. Gurney's Apology, which is not at all apologetic, but is a forthright, scathing, and quite logical defense of her so-called social offense and the freedom of her infidel brain and infidel body against social hypocrisy. Might she or someone in William's family be the source of the manuscript fragment at Clay? Again, I just discovered this. I don't know whether I'll be able to find out anything further. But the Gurney family brings us back to Norfolk in the 1790s. It was a huge extended, as I'm sure those of you who are local know, a huge extended Quaker kinship network that include Bartlett Gurney, who was the candidate in the 96 election. More distantly, John Gurney, Thelwall's London lawyer friend, who served as junior defense counsel in the treason trials and certainly helped Thelwall set up his farm in Wales, helped him financially. It had even probably introduced Thelwall to George Birkbeck, who was a lifelong friend, very important. And the Birkbeck and Gurney families are part of that larger kinship network. But the Gurney I'm interested in here more is Louisa Gurney, who was Thelwall's most responsive fan in Norfolk, although he did not write a fan club poem to her. By the way, that term is my term, fan club poem. He never called those poems that. Louisa lived at Earlham Hall, now part of the UEA campus. She was one of 11 children, several of whom, especially the girls actually, spearheaded the family tradition of social activism. Her better known older sister was Elizabeth Fry, the prison reformer. But Louisa was considered the most intellectually talented in the family. She exemplifies what Kathleen Gleadle calls the juvenile enlightenment, the, quote, electric politicization that the French Revolution evoked in British youth. Louisa was just 11 years old when she began her delightful Quaker Journal of Conscience in 1796, and it's here in the record office. It offers direct evidence of Thelwall's impact, not only on youth, but on his citizen fans. In it, she adopts revolutionary language, questions institutions, criticizes social inequality, and advocates all things democratical. Hers is an engaging voice, passionately idealist, but morally and intellectually quite sophisticated, kind of like a cross between Anne of Green Gables, Anne Frank, and Greta Thunberg. In one of her most effusive entries, she recounts that Thelwall spoke so charmingly. I felt so enraptured with him. I felt a sort of admiration and love for him. In a letter to a friend at the same time, she wrote, "How does thee like Thelwall? If thee has only a crumb of brain, thee must admire him. I am quite in love with him. I do like him so, so very much." Prepubescent crush, indeed. And I have to admit to having a bit of a crush on Louisa myself. But the fact is, her journals show how much people learned from Thelwall's lectures, doing exactly as he advised. She works for herself in what he called those grand inquiries in which it is the happiness and interest of man, and he includes women in that, to be engaged. She applied Roman history to contemporary issues of governance and war, says Kathleen Gleadle, observing, for example, what an unjust institution plebeians and patricians was. It divided the Roman people so much. Now, Louisa moderated her political opinions in later life, as did Amelia Alderson Opie, aging into a strict Quaker who disavowed her youthful excesses. But not all female radicals made that shift to the right. A case in point is Sarah Wilkes, Louisa's exact contemporary, who probably also attended Thelwall's lectures, for she was the daughter of the Revolutionary Reverend Norwich Baptist Mark Wilkes. She seems to have been just as outspoken as her father, for when she published his memoirs after his death in 1819, she reprinted his powerfully radical sermons, defending them in the strongest terms against, quote, friends who have indeed advised me to suppress the publication. On the contrary, her preface maintains that the principles of the French Revolution yet survive. Before entering into a cogent and forceful summary of French and English politics, including the treason trials, in which she uses one of Thelwall's favorite botanical metaphors. The seeds of freedom have become forests, and though such forests may have been injured or spoliated, yet the mighty trunks remain stable and uninjured. I think that's just a wonderful phrase. Sarah Wilkes proves that embryonic voices of radicalism and female citizenship did survive and speak in many obscure, ordinary, unremembered corners of Britain during the long years of repression between 1796, the first Reform Act of 1832, and the passage of full female suffrage in 1918. In fact, Thelwall's granddaughter, possibly his last surviving descendant, Edith Fanny Thelwall, may have been a suffragette. One of the great pleasures of writing this biography is being introduced to all these women across the country. And thanks in this case to Patty O'Boyle, who has done the most important work on Thelwall's descendants. And that's where I got the Fanny, Edith Fanny from. So I want to conclude now with another important, though completely different connection between Thelwall and Norfolk that takes us much further back in time, in fact, to the 7th century, when this was East Anglia, ruled by King Raedwald, who may be the guy in the Sutton Hoo ship burial. According to the Venerable Bede, Raedwald was the patron of Edwin of Northumbria, exiled from his rightful kingdom of Deira by his brother-in-law Adelfrith. After spending his youth in the Welsh kingdom of Gwynedd and Saxon Mercia, Edwin sought the protection of Raedwald, who helped him regain his throne at the Battle of Bawtry, which you can see middle bottom on that map on the right-hand side, on the River Idle, the year 616. Edwin is the hero of Thelwall's epic, The Hope of Albion, which tells the story of his own life and times through those of the historical Edwin, whom he calls freedom's first prototype of justice, equal law, and equal rights. Like his avatar, Thelwall too sought and found hospitality in East Anglia, the Midlands, and Wales, and traveled through Northumbria and other places associated with Edwin, doing research as he lectured. As you can see on another of my homemade maps, in which Edwin's history and geography are superimposed on Thelwall's lecture routes. Among Thelwall's polymath personae from youth, all those many of them, was the radical antiquarian. Hasn't been noticed really at all, and there's a huge amount of work to be done on it. He was mentored by Joseph Robin Hood Ritson and the Welsh Bard of Liberty, Iolo Morgannwg. All this fed into his hope of Albion, which originated in his youthful ambition to write a romance of Roman Britain and grew into an epic allegory of Thelwall's political ambitions, principles, successes, and defeats, which he continued to write, recite, publish, and teach from for 40 years. Having written the first draft, some 6,000 lines, or roughly 5 books, in Wales in 1798, it's not surprising that his adventures in Norfolk just beforehand played an important role. In fact, East Anglia is the chief setting for the fragments that remain, in which Thelwall dramatized the dynamics of his visit here in the 1790s, including the attack at Great Yarmouth. He mentions the banks of the Yar and the treacherous walls of Castor, the Roman fortress just across the mouth of the river from Yarmouth. And Edwin's oratory reproduces the rhetorical strategy of Thelwall's print pamphlets in the wake of the Yarmouth attack. the very pamphlets we have in the deposition there. As he vows to confront these demons on themselves, turn their vile arts. Beside Thelwall's battle of words, the plot centers on the conflict in Raedwald's court, whether to stand by Edwin or betray him to Adelfrith's minions. According to Bede, this actually happened. Meanwhile, Edwin is advised to flee by Raedwald's son, Rainier. We don't know if that's historically true. I mean, Rainier was Raedwald's son, but the whole scene probably not true. But partly because Rainier is based transparently on Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who did, in fact, advise Thelwall to flee. The text we have climaxes with Edwin replying no to Rainier, declaring he will no longer fly, no longer tremble, but take my stand stag-like and turn upon my foes. He throws down the tracing spear with which he has been writing on the wall, and instead strikes his martial spear upon the ground, vowing to act upon his hopes in rousing blank verse that rises to Shakespearean heights and at its best prefigures Yeats and Shelley, as in the passages on the right-hand side there. In following the Norfolk fiasco with his constitutional epic, Thelwall rewrote his defeat here as a victory, as he would do repeatedly through his life. His wish fulfillment dramatization of the founding of the British Constitution in a post-Roman, pre-Norman Saxon democracy by a champion who redeemed his fallen nation through the power of his voice is heady, heroic stuff. But significantly, it is unfinished. The great battle at Bawtry that brought about the historical Edwin's triumph is nowhere to be found. Either it's disappeared or he never wrote it. Chronologically, the fragments we have end with Book 5, in which Edwin courts martyrdom. And then Thelwall leaves us hanging, like Edwin's listeners, the factious, hostile throng, only temporarily enraptured by his voice. So to end, of course, that voice is gone now, as is Thelwall's hope. The fight for equal laws, equal rights, and social justice continues in our own time. What we're left with are only fragments, pieces of an endless puzzle. But it is coming together, and even unfinished, Thelwall's life is pretty damn inspiring, because he never gave up, nor did his fellow citizens. According to John Mee, many radicals, including Thelwall's mentor, Morgana, embraced a discourse of regeneration, whereby the spirit of ancient British liberty and democracy might always be revived. For Thelwall, who believed print was fixed and dead, but voice was eternal, the hope of Albion could be reanimated by taking the words of the past into the bodies, onto the tongues of the present. Kind of like Blake's Milton actually entering his body through his feet and then coming out and being channeled into the great visionary poem, Milton. Thelwall did precisely the same, but more usefully through the poetic feat of his prosodic therapy. In a headnote to Book 5 of his epic, in his elocutionary volume, The Vestibule of Eloquence, he says he wishes to transfer the poem from the silence of my portfolio to the memory of those whose voices hereafter may give them expression, not less effective from their having been used as instruments for the improvement of the energies of oratorical delivery. In 1867, 33 years after his death, one of Thelwall's pupils recalled that animating power which he taught us. The effect of his delivery of Satan's address to the fallen angels was like an electric shock. It sent a thrill through me, which after 40 years I feel still, as I try to imagine him standing at my side, would that he were, repeating the same words as he might now deliver them, in the sense, with some change of circumstances, of their present application. Awake, arise, or be forever fallen.